Thank you, Zelana. I'm so glad to have you here today. So as I mentioned, I think this is this new normal that we're going to be entering. And I really think your expertise is more important than ever. I think we're all having a lot of feelings, like I mentioned, in the medical community and personally, where some days you feel profound gratitude and happiness and connected to people in ways you've never been connected to them. And then the next minute, it's stress, it's grief for not being able to see people, missing graduations, life moments, deaths, and anxiety as well. And one of the things that you talk about that really resonated with me before all of this, and I keep reminding myself during all of this, is that you really recommend that we don't focus our energy on trying to be happy. And that shouldn't be our goal. And I was wondering if you could explain a bit about why you make that recommendation.
Yes. So, I started out, and we don't have a ton of time today on the call, but I just want to briefly give a little bit of history to that. I mean, I started out as a happiness researcher, and most of my academic work was in researching the connection between happiness and positive health outcomes. And I quickly realized that it wasn't actually the feeling of happiness that was leading to all of these outcomes, but it was really the thinking pattern and our perception that created these positive thinking patterns. So in a sense, it was really misleading, a lot of the research. So I pivoted my work to really study resilience, which I believe to be the skill set that actually creates sustained contentment over time. Because really, when we talk about happiness, we want to feel that consistent joy, and that really is not just those fleeting feelings that come and go. I think what makes our obsession with happiness, especially in our culture, particularly traumatizing, is that if we anchor our goals in a feeling that comes and goes, we set ourselves up for failure every single time. And we focus on why we're not happy and what's wrong instead of what's right. And what I've been telling a lot of people during this crisis, and any crisis we're going through, any challenge, is that when we are able to pivot our perception and our thoughts into what we have versus what has been taken away from us, that's when we really start to find those meaningful moments of joy that we can hold on to, and really hold on to meaning and purpose versus just these fleeting, pockets of joy that then ultimately leave us pretty depleted.
Yeah. And I love also was, you talk about resilience. And one of the things that I think is so important is that resilience is something that you can learn. So happiness is a feeling, like you said, it comes and goes. And sometimes it's okay not to be happy. And sometimes you need to not be happy. Yeah. I've been reminding myself that it's okay to live right in those moments, those not happy moments.
Yeah, I mean, I would challenge you to say, not just is it okay, it's critical.
Yes.
We can always be happy. And for those of us who are striving toward that goal, or who feel like we are always happy, there's something really wrong with that picture. We're human, and part of the human experience is to experience the plethora of emotions that are healthy and important and all very, very normal to feel.
Right. And I think of those of us with kids too, I think sometimes can make the mistake of trying to make our kids happy all the time. And yes. So I'm also reminding myself that that's also not the end goal. And even more than that, I know I've heard you talk before about post-traumatic growth. Yes. And I think that the idea that not only is it okay to not be happy, but we may actually grow from these hard, traumatic, they are traumatic times that we're going through right now. And I think that that's such an important one right now. And I mean, it's something that I wish for myself, for companies, for the country, for everyone, that may we all grow through this. And I think you have some really good tips on that. And I'm wondering if there's anything in particular that we can be doing right now and how we're coping with this that could lead to that growth.
I think that's a really important point to bring up. And I think that, we have to understand, first and foremost, like you said, resilience is a skill. It's not something we're born with or without. And it's not something that we achieve just because we're going through a challenge. Just because we're dealing with this virus does not mean that all of us are going to come out to be more resilient. So, so challenge does not equal resilience. We all know people who have gone through a crisis who have not come out of it in a better headspace or stronger or more, flexible in their thinking patterns. So, how are we able to utilize this time to grow is really the essence of what we can and should be doing right now. And I think a lot of that is already happening. Every growing pain is you're going to experience hardship and struggle. And that's part of growing pains, right? So I want for everyone to remember that as well. I think this time in our lives is actually, if I could sort of like create, and of course without any of the health ramifications, but if I could create like a perfect petri dish of how to actually flex our resilience muscles, this is kind of it, like, these kinds of challenging times. So it's a great opportunity to build our resilience. And when I talk about post-traumatic growth, PTSD versus PTSD, it's really about the struggle creating the meaning and the positive change. So the way that we can experience post-traumatic growth is by shifting our perception of what we're experiencing. So a big thing for us to remember is that adversity does not guarantee suffering. It's the way we think about the situation at hand that guarantees whether or not we're going to suffer because of it, right? Now, I'm not talking about the health ramifications. That's something different. But when we're talking strictly about a mental health response, are we responding to this time or are we reacting? So it's this quality of mental agility that sort of hinges on our ability to mentally sort of decanter our stressors and think about things from a different perspective. So we're pivoting our attention from this like narrative that we have to a more observational part. So what you can do if you're experiencing, for example, a lot of trauma from this and a lot of anxiety, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But when we're talking specifically about PTSD and experiencing growth from this, is really paying attention to, the feeling aspect is one thing. So allowing ourselves to feel all the feelings, that's a really important part of this, is to grace ourselves that compassion like we would give our best friend. If he or she were to call us up and talk about how we're feeling about this time, we would not probably be nearly as hard on them as we would on ourselves. So if you're feeling, I know I myself am feeling grateful, and at the exact same moment, I'm feeling overwhelmed and I'm feeling stressed, but I'm also feeling happy to be with my family, right? So there's all these different feelings that we're feeling. And so the part of experiencing post-traumatic growth is increasing our ability to tolerate these various emotions that come in and out of our head at any given moment. So instead of thinking and seizing up and having this fight or flight response to, oh my gosh, I'm feeling really upset and sad and anxious right now, it's instead really pivoting, again, that perception and saying instead to ourselves, I'm feeling sad and anxious and scared. And I'm also feeling okay the next moment. And I'm okay with that. Or even if I'm not okay with that, I'm okay with not being okay, right? So anytime you push against a feeling, you give it a lot of power. And so what I'm really encouraging people right now, especially to do, is to be gracious with themselves, see the feeling for what it is, and then you tame it. And that way you're able to really roll through it as opposed to it stopping you in its tracks. And that's how we experience that growth metric.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. And I think that the pivot thing is an interesting one. I would be curious your thought on this, because I do find myself, and I don't know if it's because I'm from the Midwest or what, but downplaying. So saying I'm overwhelmed right now, but I shouldn't be because I'm not in an ICU right now, and I could be somewhere worse. Or I have friends who call me and are saying I'm overwhelmed, I'm home with my kids all day, but I'm not working like you, so I shouldn't complain. And I'm like, no, you can be overwhelmed. Like you can also. So I'm wondering the difference between sort of downplaying versus pivoting, and how I think what I'm hearing you say is maybe just that you say and you just sit in that place maybe a little bit before moving.
Yes, and that's such an important distinction. We in our culture tend to downplay a lot, and it doesn't do ourselves any service. It comes from a place of wanting to be sort of more humble and compassionate, but really what we're doing is telling ourselves that it's not okay to feel what we're feeling, or to be who we are. I had a really good friend tell me the other day, stop apologizing. Yes, you're a mom of 3 and you have a 7-week-old baby. It's okay to feel overwhelmed, because I did the same thing. I'm like, well, at least I'm not, in the ICU, or at least I'm not dealing, So feel the feeling, gift yourself that compassion, without playing it down, and see it for what it really is. I am very overwhelmed right now, and I'm going to sit in this space. I'm going to allow myself that time, but it also requires a little bit of self-understanding and honesty, so that when you are able to feel that shift, and all of a sudden you go from being scared, and that moment you're scared, but then you see something, or someone says something to you that kind of wakes you up, and you are no longer scared at that moment. Give yourself that moment of also knowing that you're not scared at that moment, and slowly those moments become longer time frames, and that's how we transition.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yes. Yeah, no, definitely. And then I think, another piece of this with the, you mentioned this is kind of a good time actually maybe to pause and do some reflecting. I know that also comes and goes. There's some moments where I feel like, I have all the time in the world, I have nowhere to go. And then just as quickly that moment can go, and you feel overwhelmed with distractions everywhere. But one of the things that I know that you've talked about, and you talk about in your book, is about forming habits. And I know in the beginning, a lot of us slipped into sort of bad habits. At least I should speak for myself. So I started baking all the treats and cookies and things that I never would usually bake, and sleeping, maybe staying up later than I should, not exercising as much. And I think we all kind of were just coping in the frantic beginning, but as things rolled on and the weeks rolled on, that's obviously not sustainable, or we wouldn't recommend that as
For
sustainable.
yourself.
For me, for my patients. And so as we think about this really being a new normal, and the possibility of sort of going in and out of this, I'm wondering if you have any tips about how we can develop more adaptive, maybe more productive habits. While we're in this space.
Yeah, I think habits are really critical. I talk a lot about habits in my book. Habits are sort of the foundation for building the skill set of resilience. And every habit, really, if we distill it, has sort of a cue and a reward. So for example, my nightstand, let's say, is my cue to leave my phone on it when I go to bed. And my reward is sort of the feeling of having the phone and sort of this mindless numbing that I experience before bed. But it's impacting my sleep pattern. Let's say that's happening, right? So
let's say, hypothetically.
So how do I break that bad habit? You have to take away the cue and reap a different reward. So what I would do is I would make it harder on myself physically to even get to my phone. So I would either leave it in a different room, or I would go so much as to leave it in my car, because I'm not going to leave my house to go to my car to get my phone in the middle of the night, unless I'm really psychotic or it's an emergency. Right. So to make it harder on yourself, and then the reward, and I replace it with a different reward. So then I would put, maybe an enjoyable magazine or a book or something to replace that need to grab something next to you. So to make it harder on yourself. So that's kind of how we start to play with our habits. And to do that, you really need to think about, what are the habits that you are open to changing right now? What is working and what isn't? Honestly, I feel like social media and being in touch, digitally with my friends right now is really important. It's working for me. Before this crisis, it was not working for me. I had to really, really, really cut down on my digital time. Right now, I'm allowing myself a little more time because of the state of the world, and it's working for me. So again, reevaluate, given the situation, what you want to work on, and then really write down, and again, I have this all in my book too, but if you have just like an empty journal, write down, what is the cue, what is the reward, and go through that mental exercise of replacing the rewards with something else, and doing that for yourself. But I don't I don't suggest, taking on 5 habits a day. I mean, this is, we need time to develop better habits. So give yourself, 1 habit every few days or 1 habit a week or however you want to tackle it. But I think that's really important. And I also want to note that if you have a way of living now that's working for you, that's great. But sometimes I really suggest people mix it up. So it kind of, gets our brain into this fresh state that we can fall into during quarantine where, yeah, okay, we wake up every morning and we drink our green juice and then we go work out and then we do our calls for the day and then we take a walk. And that's great. We should be absolutely focusing on our nutrition and our exercise first and foremost for self-care. But maybe do it at a different time, maybe switch up your juice, that actually refreshes your brain and puts you in a different headspace to take things on differently so you feel better about yourself too.
So just changing up the routine, even doing things at different
Changing
times
up the routine, even if it's working for you. Yeah.
Okay. And I think that's an interesting that you mentioned about the phone, and we've talked about and joked about this before, that sometimes it's easier to see things in our children or our partners or our friends when they have bad habits or what their habits are. I could tell you all of my husband's habits, but the idea of stopping and reflecting on your own habits, I think is really important. I actually noticed we've had done the same with the screen time, obviously with our children and with ourselves. There's just been more of it, and we're trying to focus on the content, making sure it's working. And, but I've noticed my son is constantly, his eyes are darting toward the laptop where he does his calls or where he does his games. And we have started, and sometimes then he will run over there and jump on or run over there and check something. And so we have done that. We've started when school's over and the laptop goes away, or when my work is done and the laptop, we put the electronics in a drawer that's away, and we put phones away, out of arm's reach, out of eyesight too. But that's something that we've really been noticing. And again, it took me seeing it reflected. And like we've talked about before, that our children also often reflect our own behavior.
They always do.
So, but I saw it in him. It was like, oh, I do this too when my phone is right there, my laptop is right there.
It's really hard right now with technology, and that's something to really think about with regard to our mental health and our well-being is how much are we, okay with, and what's really pushing us over the edge, and to create those physical spaces that remove us from technology, so that we can also be human and just be, in our thoughts.
Yes, definitely. So I wanted to just, before we get to the Q&A, just briefly, you mentioned about the anxiety and the coping. And I think that that is something that we're seeing in ourselves, in our children, and everyone around us, that even in the quarantine. And I think that is going to be escalated a lot as we've all become afraid of other people, of interacting, of touching things, of going into spaces. And the idea that we're all going to experience it very differently, and that is going to be a stress as well. And I'm wondering if you have anything we can be doing now as we start to have those feelings, just recognizing our own anxieties, then as we move forward into this new.
Yes, I think the first thing is just, like I said, to really grace yourself that that compassion that you're going to feel a variety of feelings, and this is an anxiety provoking time. We are right now in an elevated state constantly of alert. So make sure you are giving yourself and your body times and abilities to have breaks from that intense anxiety. And one of the ways that we can really lower our cortisol levels is by being in nature, being outside of, based on CDC guidelines and keeping up our safety, obviously, but seeing greens, getting outside is really critical for our hormones and our emotional state. Also, cultivate hope. There's ways to cultivate hope through this period by visualizing a healthy you, for example, by, thinking of yourself next month amongst people and feeling that feeling of seizing up, but then taking a deep breath in the comfort of your own home and almost like role playing that situation for yourself so that when the time comes, you're more equipped to deal with that. Also, a really big piece of this is limiting the media you're getting and the news you're getting about everything. There is so much conflicting information out there. Really just rely on sources that you really, really trust, that you know are scientifically based. Or I honestly say, forget even the news and just go to people. If you have that one trusted doctor, the epidemiologist that you went to high school with or something, you know, someone that you really, really trust that can deliver the content in a way that makes sense to you and that makes you feel like you have a handle on the information. I think that's the biggest piece of this virus, is that there's so much out there that we are feeling completely overwhelmed, even if the data isn't as dubious or scary as many of us seem to feel it is, because there's just so much of it. And then I would say also, you know, keep up your health and nutrition, keep up moments to yourself. If you have your family at home with you, if you're trying to work, if there's a lot of people in a space all at one time, make sure you are finding time for yourself, whether that means locking yourself in a bathroom for 5 minutes or even going in the car and turning up the music. I'm not saying I ever haven't done that, but going for a drive, you know, just get time for yourself is really critical.
That's great. I think that hope, that two things, the hope message, I think is particularly tricky right now because we don't know what July is going to look like. And I have been doing that. And I said to someone the other day, I had planned our whole trip to Minnesota in July. Road trip, we're going to do that. And people are like, you think you're going to be able to do that? And I was like, I don't know, but what's getting me till tomorrow is picturing myself on the lake, you know, where I go every summer with my kids. And that just feeling, and it may change, and that's fine. But for right now, I'm going to hope that there's a way I can do that. And then the piece about finding a trusted source of news that you can go to, choose one source. I think that's really important, or a trusted person. I mean, I love when I talk to the parents of my patients and I say, oh, you've probably read about, and they said, no, I'm not. I figure you'll tell me if I need to know about it. I'm like, that to me is the best. I love to be able to be that source for people. I do it for friends as well. Because I guess if, you know, we don't all need to be in the weeds in this right now. And, you know, the rest of us sort it all out before.
Absolutely.
Before we go there. So, all right. Well, we have, please feel free to submit any questions into the chat on the side as we go, and then we'll answer those as they come up. I have a few other ones as well. There was one here that is asking about how to explain to kids why they can't see their friends. I think this is one that I get asked about. I actually talk directly with my patients about this as well. I think it really depends on the age of the child. And I think one thing with this that's really important is to recognize where your child is developmentally and put it in their terms. And I think that we sometimes put our own adult context on things. And, you know, for a 3 or 4-year-old, I think that if they ask, I think you can explain that there's germs that are making people sick. And so we're going to spend time together. We can't get germs, you know, from other kids right now. For the older kids, I think there's some great, I don't know if people know about Brain Pop, but they have some cartoons. The NPR put out a cartoon that explains the coronavirus, really common, plain language for kids. And then I think, you know, for the teenagers, really getting more into, and Zelana, I'd be curious for your thought on this. I think really recognizing, and also like we talk about holding that emotion for us as they're asking you these questions, really diving deeper with them about how they're feeling about it, what their worries are, what their questions are, and letting them share in a very non-judgmental way, I think is very important. And I had a mom I was talking to that she was apologizing because she felt like she'd really screwed it up because her daughter was whining about not seeing her boyfriend. And she's like, you know, people are dying from this, you know, you shouldn't be whining about your boy. And she's like, you know, oops. And I said, you know, give yourself grace too as a parent, but try to recognize that just like our moments and emotions change moment to moment, that try to keep it as non-judgmental as possible, and just empathy too, I think is a big one here.
Yeah, and it's really healthy to make mistakes with our kids and then own up to it. So
right.
I think that can be a really important growing metric for our relationships with our children too. And again, like you were saying, I mean, really striking a balance between answering questions well enough without fueling the flame of anxiety, for sure, and thinking about what your children absolutely need to know versus, you know, what what you're sort of putting in there, right? And I think with teens especially, it's important to remember too, from like a mental health perspective, that the teen, you know, age bracket, they're going through a natural separation from us, and then now they're being thrown into seeing us 24/7. So it's really, really important, especially with teens, to give them space. And like you were saying, ask them questions. I always, when I'm talking about resilience and cultivating resilience with our kids, the biggest piece of this is to, instead of just telling them what to do or what to know, we are in a sense just asking them questions, right? And more leading with curiosity versus just this top-down approach.
Yeah, definitely. So there's one question, another follow-up was about how reliable the antibody tests are. Briefly, I think there's a lot of very unreliable tests on the market. So I would definitely ask your physician about the tests. There's a lot of people who raced to sell these tests on the open market. And they are not, most of them actually are not reliable. That said, UCLA has a antibody test out now that is quite reliable, and they validated, and Cedars is coming out with one in the next couple of weeks. So the big academic institutions, definitely. Stanford has one now with 24-hour turnaround time. LabCorp and Quest, some of the bigger labs also have ones that are pretty good, but I would say just check with your physician. If it seems too easy and too good to be true, and it's someone, you know, on Melrose who's just popped up a shop to sell antibody tests, I would be skeptical of those. This is a really big one that we're dealing with this too. How do you suggest employees communicate with their employers about anxiety returning to work? Yeah, I think that this is a big one.
I think there has to be a really, just open communication about that. There has to be a forum for that kind of discussion. It shouldn't be happening all day, every day, throughout the day. So there has to be, in an effort to sort of contain those feelings in a way that can keep the company moving along. Employers are now creating times and spaces and places for people to talk and be open about what they're going through. And that's honestly a lot of what I've been doing virtually, is talking to teams and companies sort of hiring me to come in and talk about resilience with their teams, talk about, you know, how do we move forward? How do we deal with the work environment from a mental health perspective? If you don't have someone like me available to you, you know, I do think it's important that either from a management standpoint or someone, gather within either smaller groups or larger groups and start discussing, you know, what's our plan A, B, C, D, and how are we going to deal with those various scenarios to sort of alleviate a little bit of the unknown, the anxiety about the unknown, and then taking it a step further and going, you know, deeper into just letting people talk about their emotions about this.
Yeah. I would say on the technical side of it, OSHA also has a really comprehensive how to make the workplace safer for COVID. And I think that's something that I've sent to patients and that we're using in our office too. And then showing the employers, like you said, here's the recommendation, here's all the steps that we're taking in our workplace. Our office is a little different because we have, you know, obviously essential things that we need to do that require us to be within 6 feet of people. And so, but we're doing exactly what you just said, which is really encouraging people. And then I think modeling too. So modeling, like, this piece of it makes me really nervous. Here's what I'm going to do when I come back to work to deal with that situation. So that people can really, because we are seeing that everyone's comfort level is very different. And so we just, you know, we need to be open and honest about that. And then, the other thing I would say is figuring out why people are nervous about certain things too, I think is also important, because you can't really explain to them how you're mitigating risk if you don't know that where the anxiety is coming from. It may be because they have a high risk person at home, or they may be susceptible to certain things, or they may have read something that isn't true anymore, or something like that. And then let's see. Oh, so someone asked about, should employers talk actively with their teams about resilience? I think you talked about that briefly, Zelana. I think that certainly, if that's something that you can bring into the workplace, and I mean, like Zelana mentioned, she does consulting all the time with companies. But I think helping people come out of this in a stronger is great if you can do this. I guess, Zelana, do you want to talk, do you usually do workshop formats, or how do you go about that with teams?
Yeah, I do workshops. I also do just like a talk or a keynote, and then we do like a confidential Q&A, or we do breakouts. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that I work with companies depending on their needs, but definitely feel free to reach out about that if that's something you're interested in.
Give everyone your book. I recommend it. It's on Audible too. I listen to it. I go back to it. I can never do it all at once, but I always get pieces and get better each time.
You're not
give myself grace when I don't do it all.
Yes.
So someone asks, my child's school never closed. It's a private kindergarten. Is it safe to send them back to school / daycare for those that are open? So this is a really hard question, because I'm getting a lot of these questions of, is it safe to do this? And unfortunately right now I can't say yes, it is safe to do much, because there's just so much unknown. I don't know where this person is, if they want to chat what part of the country they're in, because that also depends on what the prevalence is. And I think what I mentioned, the testing earlier, we don't really have a handle right now on how widespread COVID is in different communities, because different communities are testing in such a different way. I think LA is getting to the point now that we will really, she's in Los Angeles. Okay, good. So we are getting to the point now where we are going to have widespread testing. We really will have an idea of what the prevalence is. And I think we're going to have a better idea. I think for this person, there's going to be risks to sending your kids to school right now, and there will be even in the fall. And so you're going to have to decide what your risk profile is. So how high risk are you? How high risk are you from how high risk are other people in your home? And then also your risk tolerance. And I think everyone also needs to weigh the benefit of sending their kid to school versus keeping their kid at home. And, I have a lot of physician friends whose kids have been going to daycare this whole time, because they're working every day. So there are kids that have been doing it, and they just have had to make that assessment. So everyone's going to have to be weighing these risk benefit. I'm getting a lot of calls now as people are looking towards summer. Things are starting to relax, even if they haven't relaxed officially. Sometimes, some people are bringing nannies back in. And it's a balance. It's a conversation I have with my patients all the time. Sometimes partners disagree on whether kids should go back to school or not, whether people should travel or not. So again, I think just having these honest conversations. I will say that I don't think testing is going to be the answer. I don't think there's going to be any scenario where we can say no risk anymore. It's going to be do what you can to lower the risk, ask the school what they're doing to minimize risk, and then think through your own personal risk profile and what you're willing to do. I think back to the antibody testing, and I'm not sure if people have seen the news about, there is some data and there's some case reports coming out, and that kids may not be spared completely like we thought. There's a hyperimmune syndrome that's been reported. I know it was in the New York Times, and I was on a webinar on Saturday about this, but it's about like a month to a month and a half after infection, it's looking like. And the idea that once your kids are immune, they can go back to school and they're in the clear, that's not looking like that's going to be the case either. Plus, the other big thing about antibodies is we don't know how long we don't know if they make you immune, and we don't know how long you will be immune. We know from previous coronaviruses, it's anywhere from about 3 months to years, but not with every coronavirus. So we're going to have to see as we go what these antibody tests really mean. I'm going to see if there's any more questions. There was one other thing, Zelana, about that we didn't get to that I was going to ask you about, because it's been a really tricky one for me, is about focusing. And we mentioned some of the media distractions and things you can do around that. I think a lot of us working at home, I know I have kids at home, so when I'm doing telehealth, it can be very distracting. I also think that the news and just the anxiety of what's going to come is very distracting. And I'm wondering if you could share some of your tips about focus in general and things that we can do.
Yeah, focus is a really tough one, especially with all of this digital input that we're receiving. Our brain is pretty overwhelmed. For those of us who think that we can multitask, we actually can't. The human brain is not capable of multitasking. We have to, compartmentalize and we're trained to focus. So really it takes a lot of energy to sort of eliminate distractions and to think about, one particular thing at a time and doing it well versus just doing multiple things and not really doing much at all. So really focusing, really thinking about that one thing that you're doing in that moment. And that takes a little bit of mindfulness as well. So practicing mindfulness is a big piece of focus. Some of the ways we can do that is just by rubbing our palms together really quickly, just for a couple seconds, and just really thinking and focusing on that sensation, that heat that's being distributed into our hands. We can, be wherever we're at and just feel in the moment. So the mindfulness can be a physical feeling that we're feeling, and just tuning into that is really important. Also making sure to take short breaks throughout the day, so it gives our brain time to recalibrate, is critical. A lot of us aren't doing that. We think that, okay, I'll take a break and I'll just scroll through Instagram, or I'll take a break and I'll just, those are all okay if that's what you want to do, but that's not a break. Your brain is still processing. It might be numbing, but it's processing information. So when you take a break, make sure it's actually restorative and it's not a numbing break. And breaks don't have to be super long. They can be quick. But if you're just walking around or you're jumping up and down, that can be a break for your brain. And just really, if you're aware, that awareness in and of itself will help over time with this practice. But it's a practice. It's something we have to continually keep working on.
Do you recommend setting alarms for that? Because I notice I forget to take, my watch will sometimes remind me to get up, stand up. But do you recommend alarms? Okay. Is there any time or amount of time that you recommend for how often to take breaks?
I think that has to vary from person to person, because our brain processes information really differently. I think if you're in the flow and you're really getting a lot, you're in that moment and you're working on something and you're putting a lot of output, then you don't have to maybe take a break as soon as you would need to with something else. So really think about your day, think about your productivity and what you're trying to do, and then kind of go from, am I the type of person that can work well in shorter chunks or larger chunks, and then go from there. But I would say on average, people should be breaking every, 30 minutes to an hour or so for sure.
Ladies, I'm going to have to, Zoom has cut us short. So thank you so much both for sharing your insights with us. It's been really fascinating to listen to you both. And for everybody else that joined, thank you very much. We'll be doing a follow-up email with summaries of this talk.
Yes, we will send some bullet points, and contact information as well. So thank you so much for having us, and good luck to everyone. We are in this with you as working women, and we really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, hopefully see you in the club again when we open our doors.
Yes, we're so close now that we know we're so close. So see you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.